Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I do applaud the government for the energy it's putting into trying to improve our connectivity. There are undoubtedly still areas in my rural constituency of Stroud that are not spots, and having zoomed constantly in my River Severn village throughout the pandemic, the pizza wheel of doom when the internet is struggling and people getting frozen in strange positions is no longer funny, it's just annoying. So I recognise that improvements are needed and I see what the government is trying to do, but many of my constituents are experiencing a David and Goliath situation, and I am very worried about that, and that's where I'm going to focus my comments. Trying to deal with the might of the telecommunication companies is a pretty scary feat for any constituent, even before some of the tactics are deployed that I have sadly seen. In my short tenure as Stroud's MP since the 2019 election, I've dealt with a number of mast issues. Actually, some people are quite amazed with how many mast issues we've had coming up locally. Just to sort of summarise a couple of them, the Minister has been kind enough to be willing to look at case studies in my area, but there's been locally issues with masks in a village called Painswick, where Stroud District Council sadly infamously missed a deadline on their side, which effectively led to permission by default, which is on a very controversial site. That matter is rumbling on, but it has caused a lot of upset and stress for neighbours and the landowner. I understand this is an issue that other councils have faced in the country as well. There have been local applications in little villages in areas of outstanding natural beauty, which effectively seem to rely on terrifying elderly landowners, and it took a village to club together to get some support and professional advice to support that landowner to deal with that particular issue. There's a Stroud farmer who currently has a 10 grand rent annual payment for an existing mast. He's been offered a significantly lower amount. We know that farmers struggle to make ends meet. We know that government is telling farmers to diversify, and a lot of these incomes as a really fundamental part of getting food on their own tables, let alone putting food on ours. There is really limited negotiation. This farmer is a big burly guy and he doesn't feel bullied by it. He just said take it away, but it goes on and he doesn't feel like he's in a very strong position. I believe fundamentally that this rollout will continue to stall if the legislation is really relying on the fact that the remedy is courts. And we know that the courts, so the only remedy is for those that can afford it. Disputes have drastically increased. Stress, frustrations and anger have also increased since the 2017 changes, and I fear it will get worse. Looking at where we are now, the Electronic Communications Code does grant, it's a bit more technical, grant the code operators the right to access land, to install and maintain apparatus, and to seek such rights to be imposed by the court where agreement cannot be reached, as I've mentioned. One of the key changes introduced in 2017 was to modify the pricing mechanism that the court should apply, and as we've heard from colleagues in the chamber, there hasn't been a proper look at pricing and valuation, even in the consultation for this bill. This was a change from the market value to realign it along similar principles to compulsory purchase. And we all know how painful compulsory purchase has been for many of our communities, not just in Stroud, with examples there. The statutory assumptions to place the valuation in the no scheme or network world. This change was actually against the findings and recommendations of the Law Commission and effectively the Nordicity and Analysis Masons code, which is beyond my pay grade, but I'm told it's very, very important. We're now in a situation where the code operators typically portray landlords as a grasping group who cause delay to hold them to ransom for more rent. This is not my experience. Where the code operators are seeking to acquire new sites, there's actually a range of different reasons why challenges are put up by constituents, by local villages and by local communities. I'll just give you a few of the common themes that I've come across. High on the list is the potential effects of conflicts with the landlord's own use of the wider landholding and other tenants' activities. The potential impact on the landlord's own future development aspirations, the visual impact of unsightly and often poorly designed electronic communications apparatus on the wider landholding or host building. These are high up the list before rent comes into it. Any adverse impacts on neighbours, disputes with neighbours about a mast going up, any adverse effects on the marketability of other land or buildings, adverse impacts on the investment value, structural issues and future maintenance of a building or a structure on the site, the extent of any extended health and safety drop or fall zones, the implications of a further development granted as permitted development. All of those are on the list. It's not just about rent, it's not just about money. Stroud constituents inform me that the code operators have generally sadly proved insensitive and unsympathetic to addressing such issues. Instead, they've interpreted the ECC changes as granting them rights over any third-party land almost for free and on terms that they can dictate to do almost anything at any time. This is the mindset of the entitlement over private rights, and I believe the blinkered belief of digital communications being the only important thing that is influencing decisions. And we know that the code operators are looking to acquire large numbers of sites and to renew hundreds of leases. We know that because of those targets, no doubt, there's process orientated internally, and in all probability, the resources driven by objectives and milestones, and less about humans and less about the people that it affects. Notwithstanding, I fully accept that we are thinking about humans all over the country when we're trying to improve connectivity, but I am worried about the balance. I also find that bullying of local people is not acceptable, and no matter how much my Stroud constituents want faster this, that and the other, and how much we actually need it to work in many accounts, they do not want their neighbours bullied, and they do expect government legislation to be able to protect the weaker party. And I think on any analysis, it will be the constituent landowner and not the telecommunications that is usually the weaker party. Local councils, I'm finding councillors talking to me, they feel pretty impotent with this. Constituents don't feel that the local councils have any power, so that again there's that sort of disconnect between who they feel protected by and sort of the changes of the land legislation is an issue. I'll just give you a bit of an overview on the kind of process that the constituents have found. But Mr Deputy Speaker, please shout at me or nod at me if you want me to wind up, which I can, because I realise I'm taking some time, but these are important. It starts off with a landlord being approached by a site acquisition agent, so not necessarily a company that's well known, seeking to access land to undertake a survey. That request is then accompanied by a threat, effectively, to gain access via an application to the upper tribunal. This pointed out as being almost impossible to resist in this approach, and the likely cost to the landowner, if there is resistance, will be a vast sum of money. So that's, if you think about the elderly landowner, not my big burly farmer, the elderly landowner that's worrying about this. Access is often then unwillingly granted. This confuses neighbours, this starts arguments locally, but it's usually granted. A survey is undertaken, the landlord is sent a heads of terms, sometimes with an imploding offer of capital payment if these are agreed within a short period. Without any real attempts to negotiate or to listen to concerns raised, notices are then served under the ECC, which cock the gun for reference to an upper tribunal again for the imposition of an agreement. I will give way to my friend who's working.
Can I thank my honourable friend for so clearly summing up the process of what the Secretary of State in her contribution called community engagement?
I only wish I was as beautifully dramatic and exciting when I spoke, because I'm conscious I am reading out a list to the Chamber, but this is an important list because this is the experience of so many constituents. It's scary, it's dull, but it's also it's a very worrying time for them. If residents and businesses are lucky, as some of my constituents have been, it's usually around this stage that they instruct professional support because they're so worried, and then they start to think about how to object to the application. That's pretty late. It's pretty late in the game, so that we're a long way down the track, but people don't realise that that's an option, and a lot of them can't afford it. However, in most cases where professional support is provided, what I'm experiencing is they are successful in getting the applications refused. The question also surrounding the lack of investment by the code operators in good quality design, mitigating features such as screening or structural landscaping, reflecting the arrogant assumption that they can simply pass on societal costs of their development onto the public at large, and claiming at the same time that planning is a barrier to deployment. So all of these things are often lost in that long process before we get help to understand what really should be brought into these planning applications. And it's clear that where the planning permission is granted, landlords come under a real threat of a reference to the upper tribunal, and given the extremely high costs of litigations, quite a lot of people will fold at that point regardless of the merits of their case. I have to believe that the code operators do not set out to believe in an egregious manner, and I've met so many telecommunications companies who too come to consultations, and they're good people, they do want to find solutions, but this is time and again the programmes that the agents acting on their behalf are running through. And my fear is that the totality of the changes that we're looking at now, far from redressing the balance of power, they tip the scales further in favour of the code operators, and as a consequence the proposed changes in the bill will actually exacerbate the marketplace issues that are being experienced, even if they try to resolve some of the legal anomalies. I fear, I'm on to my last bit now, I've lost sight, I think we have lost sight, of the mission, which is how best to deploy networks in the most appropriate places, and trying to fix the issues we've experienced since 2017 with that piece of misused and effectively abused legislation that was effectively supposed to be used as a last resort, but is now very much used as a de rigueur by these companies, I don't think is the way to make improvements for these landowners, improvements for the companies, nor is it a way to roll out the improvements that the country wants to see. I would like to know from the Minister how the bill addresses what's become the main issue with the framework, which is the way the costs fall on landowners, and which have become the latest, effectively the latest bludgeon to beat them with. The cost of seeking advice is high, and often the cost of seeking advice will far outweigh any consideration that is offered, even over a 10-year period. Whatever the merits of the landlord's position, to contest any matter in the courts is very costly, and in the extreme costs associated with losing mean that a few, but the largest with much at stake, will be able to take this step, as I've mentioned. But I think we've got to just keep hammering home. I want to know why, when we have the experiences of things like the water companies, of the environmental fights that are happening all over the country, when we know that the Human Rights Act and Article 6 provides the right to a fair hearing, why are we not seeking to strengthen the alternative dispute resolution option and thinking about making it mandatory? I disagree with my friend, learned, right honourable friend down on the front bench today. I don't see why we should wait to see if this fails to make improvements that will support everybody to achieve the goals. I think, finally, just on the valuations, I was really disappointed that we haven't worked harder to think carefully about the valuations. The information that we have coming forward is it's not that there is a slight chunk off what they've already. It's not even that it's trying to rebalance some sort of ability to look at utility companies. This is a dramatic change, the offers that are coming out to people with masts on their land, and it doesn't feel fair. It won't achieve the goals, and I would like to hear from the Minister whether we can take another look at the valuation structure. But I do, as has been a negative speech, but I do thank the government for the work they are doing, but I think we can do better for everybody involved, and I think by doing better we will achieve some serious connectivity around the country, and particularly in rural areas.